The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main square of Cedar Falls, New Mexico, when she appeared. Ayanna walked slowly toward the makeshift auction platform, her traditional woven shawl draped over her shoulders, her dark braided hair catching the desert light. The crowd of 30-some townsfolk immediately fell silent, then erupted in whispers. "What's that Indian girl doing here?" hissed Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife. "Someone should tell her this ain't her business," muttered old Pete from behind his tobacco-stained beard. But Ayanna said nothing. She simply found a spot near the back and stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the wooden platform where her family's sacred land would soon be sold to the highest bidder. The year was 1923, and Cedar Falls was caught between two worlds. Telegraph wires now stretched across the desert, connecting the small town to the larger cities, while the railroad brought both opportunity and outsiders. Yet beneath this veneer of progress, old prejudices ran as deep as the ancient arroyos that carved the landscape. For most residents, the native peoples were relics of a bygone era, obstacles to civilization rather than human beings with rights and histories. Ayanna had learned of the auction 3 days earlier when young Timothy, the orphan boy who cleaned the general store, had shyly approached her at the market. "Miss Ayanna," he had whispered, glancing around nervously, "they're selling your grandmother's land Thursday morning. Thought you should know." The boy had always been kind to her, perhaps because he too knew what it meant to be unwanted, to exist on the margins of a community that barely acknowledged your presence. The land in question had belonged to Ayanna's family for generations. Her grandmother had told her stories of when their people had freely roamed these desert valleys, following the seasonal patterns of rain and growth. After the forced relocations decades earlier, a small portion had been legally granted to her grandfather as part of a federal treaty. But when her grandmother died last spring, bureaucratic confusion and deliberately misfiled papers had led officials to declare the property abandoned and without clear ownership. Ayanna knew the truth. She had the original documents, yellowed with age but still legally valid, hidden in a metal box beneath her small cabin's floorboards. But every time she had tried to present them at the courthouse, she had been turned away, dismissed, or told to come back when you have a white man to speak for you. The systematic denial of her voice had led her to a different form of protest: silence. Now, as the auctioneer, a portly man named Jeremiah Wickham, climbed onto the platform, the crowd's attention turned from Ayanna to the proceedings. Wickham was notorious for his fast-talking and shady dealings, having orchestrated similar legal land grabs throughout the territory. He wore a brown suit that strained against his considerable belly and a hat that never quite sat straight on his balding head. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wickham called out, his voice carrying across the square, "welcome to this morning's public auction. We have several fine properties available, but the crown jewel is this 60-acre parcel just 3 miles south of town. Rich soil, good water rights, perfect for cattle or farming." He gestured broadly toward the distant hills where Ayanna's ancestral burial grounds lay hidden among the sage and juniper. The crowd pressed closer to the platform, eager to participate in what they saw as legitimate business. Among them stood Frank Morrison, a successful cattle rancher who had been eyeing the property for months. Next to him, the Henderson family whispered among themselves about building a summer house. Even Doc Miller, the town's physician, seemed interested in acquiring land for future investments. But all eyes kept drifting back to Ayanna. Her presence was unsettling, not because of anything she did, but because of what she represented. She was a living reminder of the uncomfortable truths that lay beneath their community's progress. Mrs. Henderson leaned toward her neighbor and whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "Why doesn't she just speak up if she thinks she has some claim? All this standing around in silence makes her look simple-minded." Others nodded in agreement. In their world, silence was weakness, submission, ignorance. They could not understand that for Ayanna, silence was strength, dignity, and protest all woven together like the patterns in her grandmother's blankets. She had chosen to bear witness rather than beg, to maintain her dignity rather than debase herself before people who had already decided she was less than human. As Wickham prepared to begin the bidding, a lone figure on horseback appeared at the edge of the square. The man dismounted slowly, his weathered face partially hidden beneath the brim of a worn cowboy hat. This was Clint Barrett, a rancher who lived alone on the outskirts of town, a man known for his fairness but also for his fierce independence. Few knew his story, fewer still understood why he lived as he did. Barrett tied his horse to a post and walked toward the crowd, his spurs clicking softly against the hard-packed earth. As he passed Ayanna, their eyes met for just a moment, and something passed between them. Not words, not even recognition, but an understanding that some battles are fought in silence, some truths spoken without voice. The auction was about to begin, and with it, a confrontation that would change everything. Wickham cleared his throat and raised his gavel, the wooden hammer catching the morning sunlight. Now then, let's begin with our premier property. 60 acres of prime grazing land, complete with water rights and mineral claims. We'll start the bidding at $50. Frank Morrison immediately raised his hand. $50 here, he called out, his voice confident and commanding. As one of the most successful ranchers in the territory, Morrison was accustomed to getting what he wanted, and he had no intention of letting this opportunity slip away. I have 50, looking for 60, Wickham announced, scanning the crowd. Doc Miller nodded, raising the bid, followed quickly by Mr. Henderson, the banker, who saw profit in every transaction. Throughout this opening exchange, Ayanna remained motionless, her dark eyes fixed on the platform. Her silence seemed to grow heavier with each passing bid, drawing uncomfortable glances from the assembled crowd. What they didn't understand was that every number called out represented not just money, but another nail in the coffin of her heritage. $75, called out Morrison, his voice growing more aggressive as the competition intensified. Mrs. Henderson, unable to contain herself any longer, turned to her circle of friends and spoke in a voice deliberately loud enough for Ayanna to hear. Look at her just standing there like a wooden post. If she really thinks she has some claim to this land, why doesn't she speak up? Maybe she doesn't understand what's happening. Several people chuckled at this observation, emboldened by Mrs. Henderson's boldness. Old Pete, the veteran who spent most of his days outside the saloon, added his own commentary. Probably doesn't even know what money is. These people never understood the value of land ownership anyway. Young Timothy, who was sweeping the boardwalk nearby, glanced nervously at Ayanna, his face flushed with embarrassment at the adult's behavior. He had always admired her quiet strength, the way she carried herself with dignity despite the constant disrespect she faced in town. Clint Barrett stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands resting on his belt, his face an unreadable mask. He had seen enough cruelty in his life to recognize it when it appeared, whether on a battlefield in Cuba or in the supposedly civilized streets of Cedar Falls. The war had taught him that evil often wore respectable clothes and spoke with cultured voices. $85, Henderson called out, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the morning coolness. Wickham's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as the price climbed higher than he had anticipated. I have 85, looking for 90. Come now, gentlemen, this is prime real estate we're talking about. Land like this doesn't come available often. Dr. Miller shook his head and stepped back, indicating he was out of the bidding. The competition had narrowed to Morrison and Henderson, two men who prided themselves on never backing down from a fight, whether in business or elsewhere. As the bidding continued, the mockery of Ayanna grew bolder and more cruel. A woman in a blue dress, visiting from the county seat, pointed openly at her and whispered to her companion, "How sad that they just stand around like that. No wonder they lost their lands in the first place. No backbone whatsoever." Another voice from the crowd, emboldened by the general atmosphere of disrespect, called out, "Maybe she's waiting for someone to translate for her. Do you understand English, girl?" This comment drew actual laughter from several people, including Wickham, who paused in his auctioneering to grin at the speaker. But Ayanna's silence remained unbroken. If anything, she seemed to grow more still, more centered, as if drawing strength from some inner well that the crowd could not see or understand. Her grandmother had once told her that silence was the most powerful weapon a person could wield, because it forced others to confront the echo of their own voices, their own consciences. $100, Morrison declared, his voice now carrying a note of finality. He was prepared to go higher if necessary, but he hoped this decisive bid would end the competition. Henderson hesitated, calculating the risk versus reward in his banker's mind. $100 was significant money, more than many families in town saw in a year. After a long moment, he shook his head and stepped back. "I have $100 from Mr. Morrison," Wickham announced triumphantly. 100 going once, going twice. It was at this moment that something shifted in the crowd's dynamics. Clint Barrett had been watching not just the auction, but the systematic humiliation of another human being. He had seen this same dynamic in the Philippines, in Cuba, wherever powerful people convinced themselves that their strength gave them the right to diminish others. Slowly, deliberately, Barrett reached up and removed his worn cowboy hat, holding it respectfully at his side. The gesture was simple, but in the context of the morning's events, it carried the weight of thunder. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Wickham paused, his gavel frozen in midair. Barrett's action was not lost on anyone present. In the culture of the American West, removing one's hat was a sign of respect, typically reserved for ladies, churches, and funerals. By removing his hat in Ayana's presence, Barrett was making a statement that cut through all the mockery and cruelty like a blade through paper. The silence stretched, becoming almost unbearable. The silence that followed Barrett's gesture stretched across the square like morning shadows, deep and encompassing. Every eye was now divided between the rancher standing with his hat in his hands and the native woman who had somehow, without speaking a single word, become the center of everything. Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her prepared criticisms suddenly seeming small and ugly in the face of Barrett's simple act of respect. Even old Pete, veteran of countless saloon arguments and street fights, found himself shifting uncomfortably, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Wickham, sensing his control of the situation slipping away, attempted to regain momentum. "Well, that's very nice, Mr. Barrett, but we have an auction to complete here. Mr. Morrison has bid $100, going twice." His voice carried less confidence now, the earlier bluster replaced by nervous energy. But Barrett was not finished. Without replacing his hat, he stepped forward through the crowd, his weathered boots creating small clouds of dust with each deliberate step. The crowd parted before him like water, some instinctively stepping back from whatever was about to unfold. $150, Barrett announced, his voice carrying clearly across the square despite being spoken at normal volume. The bid hung in the air like a thunderclap. Morrison's head snapped toward Barrett, his face flushing red with surprise and anger. "What's your game here, Clint? You've never shown interest in that land before." Barrett turned to face Morrison directly, his pale blue eyes steady and unwavering. "Maybe I'm just now seeing it clearly, Frank. Sometimes it takes the right light to show you what was always there." The crowd murmured among themselves, trying to understand the subtext of this exchange. These were not merely words about money and land anymore. Something deeper was happening, something that made many of them profoundly uncomfortable. Morrison glanced around the crowd, looking for support, for someone to explain why his certainty about owning this land was suddenly being challenged by a man known more for his solitude than his business dealings. 175, he countered, his voice tight with frustration. 200, Barrett replied immediately, not even pausing to consider the amount. The sum represented nearly a year's income for most people present. Wickham's eyes were now wide with excitement at the escalating bids, his earlier nervousness forgotten in the face of potential profit. $200 from Mr. Barrett. "Do I hear 225? Morrison opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. $200 was more than he had planned to spend, more than the land was probably worth in pure economic terms. But this was no longer about economics, and everyone present seemed to sense it. After a long moment that felt like hours, Morrison shook his head and stepped back. 200 going once, Wickham called out, scanning the crowd for any other bidders. Going twice. He paused dramatically, savoring the moment. Sold to Mr. Clint Barrett for $200. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. Scattered applause began among the crowd, the kind of polite acknowledgement given to any successful business transaction. But the applause died quickly as people realized that Barrett was not moving toward the platform to complete his purchase. Instead, Barrett walked slowly toward Ayana, still holding his hat respectfully at his side. The crowd watched in growing confusion as he approached the woman they had been mocking just minutes earlier. When he reached her, he stopped and looked directly into her dark eyes. "Miss," he said quietly, but loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear, "I believe this land belongs to you." From inside his worn leather jacket, Barrett produced a folded document, a deed transfer form he had obtained from the courthouse that morning before the auction. With deliberate care, he signed his name at the bottom and then extended both the deed and a pencil toward Ayana. "If you'll sign here," he continued, "this land will be returned to its rightful owner." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her voice shrill with indignation. "Now wait just a minute. You can't just give away property like that. There are procedures, legal requirements." Barrett turned to face her, his expression calm but firm. "Ma'am, I just bought this land fair and square. I reckon I can do whatever I want with my own property." For the first time since arriving at the auction, Ayana moved. She reached out and took the pencil from Barrett's weathered hand, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. The crowd watched in stunned silence as she carefully signed her name at the bottom of the deed, her handwriting clear and educated, belying all their assumptions about her intelligence and capability. As she handed the documents back to Barrett, Ayana spoke for the first time that morning, her voice clear and strong, carrying easily across the now silent square. "Thank you," she said simply. "My grandmother told me that sometimes justice comes not from those who speak the loudest, but from those who understand the weight of silence." Ayana's words hung in the desert air like morning mist, carrying more weight than all the shouting and mockery that had preceded them. The crowd stood frozen, many seeing her clearly for the first time, not as the silent figure they had dismissed, but as a woman of intelligence, dignity, and profound strength. Barrett carefully folded the signed deed and placed it in Ayana's hands. "The land is yours now, legally and properly. No one can take it from you again." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm sorry it took so long for someone to do what was right." Mrs. Henderson, her face red with embarrassment and anger, pushed forward through the crowd. "This is outrageous. There must be laws against this sort of thing. You can't just hand over valuable property based on some sentimental notion." Dr. Miller, who had remained quiet throughout the auction, stepped forward and placed a restraining hand on Mrs. Henderson's arm. "Actually, Helen, Mr. Barrett is well within his rights. The transaction was legal and proper." He looked toward Ayana with newfound respect. "And perhaps it's time we admitted that justice isn't always found in our courtrooms." Young Timothy, unable to contain his excitement, broke away from his sweeping duties and approached Ayana with a wide grin. "Miss Ayana, I'm so happy for you. Your grandmother would be proud." His innocent joy cut through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. Ayana knelt down to Timothy's level, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "She is proud, Timothy. She told me that kindness always finds a way to surface, even in the hardest ground." She glanced meaningfully at Barrett. "Sometimes it just takes longer than we expect." Morrison, still smarting from his defeat, couldn't resist one final attempt to salvage his pride. "This whole thing is nothing but a show, Clint. You've wasted good money on a foolish gesture. That land will probably just sit empty while she goes back to wherever she came from." Barrett replaced his hat on his head, the gesture marking a return to normal interaction, but his eyes remained hard as he faced Morrison. "Frank, that woman has more connection to this land than you or I will ever have. She didn't come from somewhere else. We did." These words struck the crowd like physical blows, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own place in the territory's history. Many had never considered that their presence might represent displacement rather than progress. Ayana stood and addressed the crowd directly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak through years of enduring their disrespect. "My silence was not ignorance or submission. It was protest and preservation. Every word unspoken was a word that could not be twisted or used against me. Every moment of quiet was a moment of remembering who I am and where I come from." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. My grandmother taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply bear witness. To stand in truth even when everyone around you chooses to believe lies. Today, one man chose to see that truth. She nodded toward Barrett. And now you all have the choice to see it too. Wickham, realizing that his auction had transformed into something far beyond a simple business transaction, cleared his throat nervously. Well, I suppose that concludes our business for today. Thank you all for coming. As the crowd began to disperse, many people walked away in contemplative silence, their earlier certainties shaken by the morning's events. Some still grumbled about the disruption of proper procedures, but others found themselves thinking about assumptions they had never questioned. Barrett approached Ayanna one final time before leaving. If you ever need anything, my ranch is just over the ridge to the west. Good neighbors look out for each other. Ayanna smiled, the first time most people had ever seen such an expression on her face. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. You've given me more than land today. You've given me proof that silence and respect can still change hearts. As Barrett mounted his horse and rode away, Ayanna looked out toward the distant hills where her family's land now legally belonged to her once again. The sacred burial grounds would remain undisturbed, the water rights would flow back to their proper guardian, and the cycle of displacement would be broken, at least in this small corner of the world. Timothy approached her one last time, his young face serious with thought. Miss Ayanna, will you teach me about silence the way your grandmother taught you? Ayanna placed her hand on the boy's shoulder, seeing in him the possibility of a future where respect and understanding might replace mockery and dismissal. Yes, Timothy. And perhaps you can teach others. Real change begins with one person choosing to listen instead of just waiting to speak. As the sun climbed higher over Cedar Falls, casting shorter shadows across the square, a new kind of quiet settled over the town. It was not the silence of submission or defeat, but the profound quiet that comes when truth finally finds its voice. If this story touched your heart and made you think differently about the power of silence and respect, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of courage and justice from America's past. What do you think was the most powerful moment in this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your perspectives on these amazing tales of human dignity. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our weekly stories that remind us what it truly means to stand up for what's right, even when the whole world seems to be watching. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history's most moving moments.